start and make sure everybody is on the same page in terms of expectations for licensure of COVID-19 preventive vaccines. The applicable statutes and regulations that FDA has to follow require a demonstration of vaccine safety, effectiveness, and controlled and consistent manufacturing to ensure continued safety and effectiveness of the licensed vaccine, in theory, in perpetuity. At this time, given the epidemiology of COVID-19 and its trajectory, we expect that at least the first COVID-19 vaccines to be licensed, if successful, will be licensed under FDA's traditional approval pathway. And under this pathway, we expect that the substantial evidence of effectiveness required to support licensure would be demonstrated in clinical disease endpoint efficacy trials that directly show that the vaccine prevents either COVID-19 disease and or SARS-CoV-2 infection. Some of you are surely aware that there are other FDA licensure pathways that are applicable in certain situations. These are the accelerated approval pathway and the animal rule licensure pathway. However, at this time, these alternative licensure pathways really would not apply to COVID-19 vaccines because, first of all, the sufficient incidence of COVID-19 disease to allow for clinical disease endpoint efficacy trials, and also the limited and evolving understanding of SARS-CoV-2 immunology and immune response biomarkers that might predict protection against COVID-19. So because of these two current conditions, the criteria for the alternative licensure pathway at this time would not be satisfied. Next slide, please. So FDA has received a lot of questions, and we've heard a lot in the press about what level will be necessary to support licensure of a COVID-19 preventive vaccine. And certainly demonstrating efficacy is necessary, it's critical, but in and of itself, it's not sufficient to support the licensure application. And one reason is that the large efficacy trial conducted in areas of high disease activity, such as have been initiated in the US this week, could rapidly accrue enough cases to achieve the specified efficacy success criteria before additional data that are important to inform benefit risk consideration for review of a licensure application are available. And these data could include, among other things, longer-term safety data, as well as data to support the manufacturing processes, the facilities, product characterization, and also demonstration of lot-to-lot consistency. This second bullet really relates back to the licensure requirement that there needs to be controlled and consistent manufacturing to ensure that vaccine produced ongoing in the future will continue to be as safe and as effective as the vaccine that was studied in pivotal trials to provide data to support licensure. Next slide, please. Additionally, the licensure review process takes some time. And this is because it must address a number of statutory and regulatory requirements for approval. The licensure review process involves review of complex clinical, non-clinical, and manufacturing data. And when we say review of the data, we're not just talking about review of clinical study reports and the applicant's assessment of the data. We're also talking about review of the data sets themselves to ensure that there are no issues with data integrity and to ensure that our scientists and statisticians can replicate the results of the analyses, the key analyses that the applicant has submitted to support licensure. As part of this review process, we often have back and forth exchanges with the applicant that include information requests and meetings to resolve issues and questions that come up. There are inspections of facilities and clinical trial sites to ensure that adherence to good clinical trial practices and good manufacturing practices occurred. There is often a safety update with longer-term safety data. Sometimes all of the safety data that are submitted to a licensure application are available at the time the application is submitted, but sometimes there are additional safety data coming in during the review, and almost certainly that will be the case with COVID-19 vaccine. The review process also includes negotiations with the applicant for a pharmacovigilance plan to continue evaluating vaccine safety after licensure. Additionally, we need to agree on plans to satisfy pediatric study requirements. As you heard, the ongoing studies for COVID-19 vaccines that have reached later stage development do not yet include pediatric subjects. And so we will need to have a clear idea of when pediatric subjects will undergo participation in vaccine studies and which age groups will be appropriate to study. And finally, and certainly not least important, for new vaccines, we often convene an external scientific advisory committee called our Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, or VRPAC, to get their input on the data available to support licensure. This process is critical to ensure transparency in FDA decision-making processes. Certainly, there is a need for transparency for regulatory decisions related to COVID-19 vaccines. And the downside of convening this committee, though, is that it requires a lot of work, both on the part of FDA as well as the applicant. And these are the same staff and personnel who are participating in the review. So looking at all of these activities in aggregate, the usual time frame for licensure review is on the order of 12 months for a standard review, or 8 months for what's called a priority review or expedited review. Certainly, there are things that can be done to be flexible within this review process to have information submitted ahead of a licensure application to pre-position the review team to conduct a more expedited review that can be done to cut down on this review clock time. But even with maximal adjustment to speed up a review, I think it would be very difficult to imagine a licensure application review process that lasts only a few weeks or even a month. So I think we need to be realistic in our expectations of how long the licensure review process will take. Next slide. So there are other regulatory mechanisms for making vaccines available that do not involve licensure, and one of these, the one that is perhaps most pertinent to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic in the U.S. is the FDA's authority to grant emergency use authorization, or EUA. EUAs are authorized under a set of qualifying criteria that are outlined in FDA guidance documents, also reflected in FDA regulations and general law. The qualifying criteria are, first of all, a declaration by the HHS Secretary of an emergency situation leading to serious or life-threatening disease or condition. We certainly have that now. There has to be evidence of effectiveness for the product intended to address the emergency. You saw in a couple slides back that the standard for licensure is substantial evidence of effectiveness. The EUA standard is worded differently. For EUA, a product has to be determined that it may be effective. Well, what does that mean, may be effective? FDA has flexibility in interpreting that standard, and it really relates to the third bullet here. FDA has to determine that the known and potential benefits of the product outweigh the known and potential risks of the product. And the intended use of the product, including the number of individuals to be treated under the EUA, as well as uncertainties in the risk and also uncertainties in the benefit, can impact the application of the EUA effectiveness standard. So if you're talking about a drug that is being authorized to treat individuals with severe COVID-19 disease, and that drug has a very well characterized safety profile based on extensive experience, either pre-licensure or post-licensure for a different indication, then the maybe effective standard could be lower than the standard required to support licensure. But on the other hand, if you're talking about a vaccine that is intended to be used in tens to hundreds of millions of individuals who are not infected at the time that they're vaccinated, and there are much more limited safety data available for that vaccine and some additional uncertainties and risks, then the maybe effective standard gets much closer to the type of evidence that we would need to support licensure of the vaccine. The final qualifying criterion for EUA is that there has to be no adequate, approved, and available alternative. And all of those three words, adequate, approved, and available, are important. So certainly if there's no licensed COVID preventative vaccine, then that standard is met. If there is a vaccine that has been being used under an EUA, then that vaccine is not approved, and so the availability of that vaccine does not count against that criterion. Similarly, if there is a licensed vaccine and if there's not enough of that licensed vaccine to address the emergency situation, that also does not count against that qualifying. Next slide. So how does an EUA work? Well, it is requested by an entity outside of FDA, typically a government stakeholder such as CDC, BARDA, or Department of Defense, or it could be requested by the manufacturer. And the EUA submission to FDA includes a number of items. The list below is certainly not exhaustive, but some key items are specific details of the requested product use under the EUA, including the specific population, the dose, and the regimen that will be used. The submission must contain contains supportive safety, effectiveness, and manufacturing information upon which FDA will make its determination of benefits versus risks. And then also the EUA needs to include fact sheets to inform patients and also fact sheets to inform healthcare providers of the conditions of the EUA and the potential risks and benefits of the proposed use under EUA. And in our guidance, FDA also recommends that for healthcare providers, the EUA include more detailed prescribing information. Now, many of the detailed prescribing information, many of the same things that we would review under licensure application, we would also review under an EUA request. But the regulations and law allow for a more rapid review of an EUA request as compared to a licensure application. If FDA does agree to authorize emergency use, this authorization comes with several conditions. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but some key conditions include monitoring and reporting of adverse events to the extent practicable, for very widespread use of a COVID-19 vaccine under an EUA. We would expect very good safety monitoring mechanisms. Conditions could also include the duration, or will also include the duration of the authorization, which can be renewed as necessary or terminated if the criteria for emergency use authorization are no longer met. And there may be other conditions for the authorization as applicable, for example, those related to distribution of the drug product or adverse. Next slide. Our guidance that we released at the end of June, which I've mentioned several times now today, does discuss additional considerations for EUA. One concern is that issuance of an EUA based on very preliminary safety and efficacy data for randomized controlled trials could reduce the ability to demonstrate effectiveness and assess benefits versus risks of the vaccine to support licensure. So we've had some questions about could an EUA be authorized just based on immunogenicity data? Could it be authorized based on a very early signal of efficacy that just meets statistical significance criteria? And the FDA thinking on those questions is no. We would really need more definitive data closer to what we would expect to support licensure. One situation where FDA thinks an EUA could be considered is for a vaccine where there is adequate manufacturing information. An EUA may be appropriate once studies have demonstrated safety and effectiveness of the vaccine, but before the manufacturer has submitted and or FDA has completed its formal review of the biologics license application. And when we say demonstrated safety and effectiveness, we are talking about to the standard required for an EUA, but keeping in mind that that standard may be very close to the licensure. Finally, the considerations for EUA licensure are going to be data-driven, no matter what the vaccine. And so any assessment regarding an EUA will be made on a case-by-case basis, considering the proposed target population, the characteristics of the product, all available preclinical and human clinical study data, and the totality of available relevant scientific evidence. Last slide. So for everyone's information, I've included some URLs to FDA resources, including our guidance document for COVID-19 vaccines, as well as the guidance document for emergency use authorization. And finally, a website that FDA maintains with information about past and present EUAs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fink, for that very informative presentation. Please remember to mute your microphones when not speaking. So we'll open this up at this time for questions. Dr. Fry.
Thank you, Dr. Romero. And thank you, Dr. Fink, for that very nice overview of the EAU. I have a question that I'm going to ask because we receive this question a lot from the public, and would just like a better understanding of what my response should be. But can you provide us with more specifics on how Operation Warp Speed and the emergency use authorization has affected the rapidity and timing of the review of the phase 1 and 2 trial data for this very first vaccine that initiated, or vaccine for which the phase 3 study was initiated this week? And when I say more specific information, can you tell us, maybe you're not allowed to, I don't know, what specific data was reviewed and how much data there was? I don't know if that's a fair question, and if it's not, Dr. Romero, please advise.
Well, I can certainly try to answer that question. So first of all, I don't think that EUA considerations really play a role in our review of data to support initiation of phase 1, phase 2, or even phase 3 trials. Those are all geared toward advancing clinical development with the ultimate goal of supporting licensure of a safe and effective vaccine. The other question you asked is about the impact of Operation Warp Speed. Operation Warp Speed is, based on my understanding, working to facilitate and de-risk vaccine development by providing funding, by helping to harmonize among different vaccine manufacturers. I'll leave it to folks who are involved in Operation Warp Speed to address any more detailed information about their involvement. But needless to say, the FDA's role is entirely independent from Operation Warp Speed. We have been conducting our usual data-driven review process for our oversight of the clinical development of these vaccine candidates. And the standards that we have been using are really not very different from our usual standards for clinical development of preventive vaccines in general. It's just that things have been progressing much more quickly with seamless and adaptive clinical trial design, and review scientists and other staff at FDA working much harder to review much more information in much shorter periods of time. Our guidance document that I provided the link to does provide more detailed information about the types of non-clinical and clinical data that we expect to see at each stage of development to support advancing on to the next stage. And if you read these bullet points in the guidance, I think you'll appreciate that they really are reflective of and consistent with the types of data that we routinely require to support development of preventive vaccines.
Thank you. Dr. Szilagyi.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Fink, for an excellent presentation. I have a question regarding the specific target population groups and the extent to which the EUA differs, the level of evidence for efficacy and safety differs for specific age groups? In other words, if the trials show significant amount of efficacy and high safety for a broader age group, to what extent are the guidance different under the UA for certain age groups, like by age or potentially underlying conditions or pregnancy, etc.?
I don't think there's a meaningful difference in terms of age groups or other demographic or medical factors by which you might classify population. The difference really lies in the standard, where the licensure standard is safe and effective, where effective means substantial evidence of effectiveness. And for EUA, the standard is may be effective and known potential benefits outweigh the known potential risks. And again, I'll emphasize that for preventive vaccines, those EUA standards are really going to, in practice, be closer to the licensure standard than for some other drug products that have been or would be considered under EUA. Whether we're talking about licensure or EUA, we do look at subpopulations and consider subpopulations independently. That doesn't mean that studies have to be adequately powered to meet statistical success criteria for specific subpopulations, but there does need to be sufficient evidence of effectiveness to support the approved use or the use under emergency use authorization for all of the populations included in the situation.
Great, thank you.
Wow.
Sorry, I was having trouble getting off mute. Dr. Bell, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Fink. That was a really very useful and helpful, informative presentation, and I really do appreciate FDA's, really outstanding and helpful guidance and FDA's sort of responsiveness to the difficulties and the trickiness that we face here. My question is sort of revolves around some of the concerns that have already been raised in general about public confidence. So I'm curious about what incentives exist for manufacturers to continue to speed the process of licensure once an EUA is issued. My understanding is that, at least theoretically, an EUA could be continued for the extent of an emergency, and not to say that the manufacturers want to have an EUA indefinitely, but there are variations in speed of submission and responsiveness to FDA's requests and such. And I'm just wondering if there are incentives in place for the manufacturers to continue to really push hard for licensure if they've had an EUA issue.
That's a good question, and I'm not quite sure how to respond other than to say that by the time an EUA would be seriously considered for a COVID-19 vaccine, that vaccine would likely be at a place that's very close to being ready for a licensure application in terms of outstanding data that are still needed in the clinical development process.
Thank you. Dr. Admar.
Thank you, Dr. Romero. And thank you, Dr. Fink, for a very clear presentation. I have a question, and I'm very pleased to see that the FDA has considered what the potential impact on conducting and completing clinical trials could be by issuing an EUA. But I guess I want to get down to the weeds a little bit in that my understanding is for the phase 3 efficacy studies, the planned follow-up period is a couple years, and at least part of that would be, as I understand it, to address some of the concerns that Dr. Edwards spoke about this morning from a safety standpoint, a la dengue vaccine, for example. And it could be that later this year or early next year, we have substantial evidence of effectiveness of one or more of the vaccine being investigated. That would occur well before the planned safety follow-up has been completed. And it may be an unanswerable question, but how does one weigh, the potential short-term efficacy that's demonstrated versus the unanswered and unknown safety questions that would be answered by a longer follow-up?
Thank you. That is an excellent question and one that we thought about and struggled with quite a bit. And the best answer that I can give you today without being opaque is that we will really have to consider the totality of the evidence available at the time that we are considering a licensure action or decision. And the totality of evidence will, of course, include clinical trial data from phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials, and looking at the extent of longer-term follow-up, both for safety and also efficacy that are available from those subjects. Also, we'll look at the non-clinical data that are available that will help to inform us about the potential risk of enhanced disease, looking at the immune response biomarkers, as well as animal models, which might include, for example, challenge models with longer intervals between vaccination and challenge to help inform what happens when antibody titers wane, for example. And so we'll have to make decisions whether it's for an EUA or for a licensure based on all of the available data. And certainly, I'm sure you can appreciate that if we were to wait, a full year or 2 years before taking a regulatory action to make a vaccine widely available, that would really be counterproductive to addressing the current situation.
I agree. Thanks.
Thank you. Not to cut the discussion short, but we need to move forward. We'll take one more question from the liaison representative, if there is anyone. If not, Dr. Foster.
Thank you very much. This has been a great presentation. Quick question. Do you think, is the ACIP allowed to make a recommendation for a vaccine under an EAU, which will have implications on people who operate under standing orders?
Dr. Romero, would you like for me to answer that question?
Yes, I was about to ask you.
Sorry. Yeah, so I'll answer that, Doran. Yes, so under ACIP's charter, there is a provision that in an emergency situation that we can issue recommendations under an EUA or other type of approval that is not full licensure.
Thank you.
Very good. We'll move on then. So we will have Dr. Messonnier present next considerations for vaccine implementation. Dr. Messonnier, please.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we all know that the success of our endeavor requires not just safe and effective vaccines, but a safe and effective vaccine program. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about our considerations for the vaccine implementation. Next slide. you know, as a starting place, an effective vaccine program needs to ensure access and high coverage in all segments of the population. And we need to start by appreciating that there are racial, ethnic disparities in our routine immunization coverage, especially in adults. This is data that you all have seen before in other conversations, but this is influenza vaccination coverage in adults by race and ethnicity, with lower vaccination coverage in Blacks and Hispanics. This disparity has existed for a long time, and you know, the current social situation likely exacerbates the issues that surround these lower vaccine coverage. But as we start planning for immunization with COVID, we need to be mindful of this as a starting place, and we need to take seriously that we need novel and more robust strategies to increase uptake of the COVID vaccine once it becomes available. Next slide. We find ourselves in a complex and evolving landscape for COVID vaccine, and we are not going to have all the answers that we need in order to start planning. And frankly, even along the way, the landscape is likely to change. And so this just lays out some of the complexities. There are multiple products. The products are some 1 dose, mostly 2 doses, and the products are not interchangeable. The vaccines have varying presentations. Vaccine efficacy and adverse event profiles are different in different populations. The cold chain requirements are different. The initial studies are not being done in children and pregnant women, and you know, it's always been one of ACIP's principles to want early studies in children and pregnant women, and we're not going to have the benefit of that for this vaccine. Our implementation plans needs to account for socially distanced vaccine practices, adding yet another complexity to our program planning. Communication and education are always key parts of any of our programs, but for this vaccine in this situation, we understand that that need is greater than ever. Both, you know, even now the rumors and misinformation about COVID vaccines are circulating, and certainly the need to move quickly, although safely and effectively, but the need to move quickly may lead folks to have incorrect assumptions about cutting corners, which we're certainly not doing. And again, the issues around communities of color and the current social situation also will exacerbate these problems. Some high-risk groups for COVID-19 from a starting place may distrust public health, and we certainly have seen this in some of our early focus groups that we're already doing to get attitudes around COVID vaccine. So as I move forward, we understand that we're asking for planning in an incredibly complex environment, and yet we need to start planning. In fact, I think many of us feel like we're already late, and so need to move forward quickly, even given the current environment. Next slide. So this cartoonish figure attempts to show all of the different aspects of vaccine implementation and a vaccine program. These look like they're sort of in sequence, but of course it clearly doesn't work that way. And so starting in the middle, in the blue on the left, we appreciate greatly ACIP's work in helping to prioritize populations and the impact of the national academies, but understand that this is going to be an iterative process, and as we understand more about the vaccines, it will impact prioritization, which then impacts every other aspect of planning. After prioritization, we need to be allocating vaccine, distributing it from a manufacturer to a distributor to a state, administering it. We appreciate the importance of gathering additional data on safety and effectiveness, as well as uptake and, of course, the need for a second dose. And finally, for folks especially who have been through H1N1, we understand the importance of planning for vaccine recovery at the end of this. In gray at the bottom, you will see the data requirements. And again, I think that everyone here understands the importance of data in any vaccine endeavor, but especially for this one. We believe it's very important for us to have end-to-end vaccine tracking and dose level accountability. That data is crucial to allow for flexibility in targeting, in allocation and ordering and vaccine management. And certainly data around adverse events and vaccine effectiveness post-licensure is always important, but it is going to be of increased importance for this vaccine, especially as rapidly as we need to roll it out. At the bottom, you'll see regulatory considerations. We appreciate FDA's partnership and understand the need to consider how the regulatory requirements impact all of the other components of vaccine implementation. And we put on top this green bar, the communication and stakeholder guidance at every level. You know, this is, again, always important and part of everything that we do, but for this vaccine in the current situation of increased importance. Next slide. One of the unknowns is what quantities of which vaccine with which characteristic is going to be available when. And I wish we would have more discrete data, but you know, we're in a world where, as anybody who does vaccine development knows, there are lots of uncertainties. We are generally planning for sort of this idea, which is at some point, we expect that there will be a constrained supply. That may be actually because there are limited doses, or because although there is more vaccine available, the doses that are released are somewhat constrained. When there is constrained supply, we will need to focus administration on some target populations. And in general, what ACIP has said, but frankly what multiple other countries in WHO have said, is that there needs to be some focus on populations where high coverage will be essential to public health. And we look forward to continuing dialogue with ACIP about how to approach this issue. But even when we have maximum supply available, we will still need to target our immunization program efforts. So broadly, great when there's lots of vaccine available, but the US government, state and local health departments will need to focus their efforts on the places where, from a public health perspective, we think it's most important. And so we also look forward to ACIP's guidance about how, when there is greater supply, they would propose that we focus our efforts. At the same time, of course, we'll work to ensure physical and financial access for everybody to this vaccine. Next slide. This is another cartoon to talk about an approach to COVID vaccination. And I guess what I would say is maybe start in the middle, which is that in general, we are planning for centralized distribution because we believe that it's the best way to allow full visibility and control and to be able to shift assets based on the available data to drive vaccine allocation. We understand the importance of kitting, making sure that ancillary supplies are available. Vaccine will be allocated to jurisdictions as per our normal programs. But in addition, we all recognize that this is an unprecedented situation. We are, as a community, being asked to do something that we've never done before, which is get vaccine out to the entire population in a very compressed timeline. And therefore, we're going to need to think outside our traditional boxes. We need to rely on our routine systems, but we also need to go beyond them. So, for example, we will be planning for allocation to some private partners so that we can expand access. Similarly, we will be planning for administration sites in traditional sectors, but we also believe we need to be planning for innovative sectors to reach certain target populations. So with all of this, again, my message is, of course, we will be relying on our traditional systems, but we also need to learn from what has gone right and not right in the past. And we need to think outside the box with turning over every rock and looking under every possible way in order to make sure that our systems are as robust as possible, and really being open to lots of partners that frankly are all wanting to queue up to help us figure out how to do an unprecedented thing. And so I would ask that we all be open to the possibilities of thinking outside our normal traditional approaches. Next slide. To distribute and administer a COVID vaccine, we have to leverage many partners, and this just emphasizes it more. There are public health experts and assets across all of the US government, federal, state, local, the VA, the Indian Health Service. There are lots of HRSA, there are lots of groups across all of us that are part of the normal public health infrastructure. But there are also a variety of private partners. We work every day with private partners in our routine work. And now here, we really need to be able to expand those partnerships across distribution, administration, and also guidance and best practices. So you will see coming to the table a variety of our traditional partners and a variety of new partners that we're working with in new ways. And I think in the end, it'll make a more robust COVID vaccination program. But frankly, also, we may see at the end of this that we find ways to expand and enhance our routine systems because of these new partnerships. Next slide. A key part of all of our programs is always going to be monitoring the safety of the vaccine. And this is just a cartoon that showcases the different stages of vaccine safety evaluation. I think you all have seen this before. It's a key part of CDC's program, and certainly a key part of what we're looking to ACIP to help us with, which is to continue to review the safety data, both pre-licensure and post-licensure. And we certainly recognize the importance of a really robust system to monitor safety post-licensure, and are working with all of our USG and multiple other partners in order to build out a plan for how we'll monitor safety. And CDC, FDA, CDC, FDA, the Health Service, DoD, the VA, I mean, those are just some of the inside government groups, but we also are certainly relying on many of our private partners that are already working with us in this space. And we need to build out these systems now so that we're ready when vaccine is licensed and ready when it starts to be used routinely. We need to be able to reassure the American public that we have our eyes on this and that we'll keep having robust evaluation all along the way. Next slide. I'm going to end on this. I hope that you all will recognize this slide, which you've seen before, which is the program that CDC launched last year to really try to talk about vaccine confidence as opposed to vaccine hesitancy. And this is our strategic framework to strengthen vaccine confidence, prevent outbreaks of vaccine preventable diseases, with the idea that it has to be a whole of community enterprise. And I find myself going back to this slide as I think about what we're going to need to be doing for COVID vaccination. The concern we already hear in the public about COVID vaccination, frankly, comes back to some of these same principles, and our approach to it needs to be holistic. That is, it's not just about COVID vaccination, it's about the public's trust in our overall vaccine programs and their trust in the people who recommend vaccines. And we really need to have a broad approach to stakeholder engagement so that we can make sure that we get the right information to the people who need to know it at the time that they need it. And we also need to decrease any barriers to access to vaccines in every community, but certainly cognizant, back to that initial slide, that we can already predict some of the communities that are going to have more resistance to vaccination. We need to start now if we're going to make sure that those communities are ready to accept the vaccine when it becomes available. So it's a long road between now and when this vaccine becomes available. And frankly, you know, it's going to take all of our partners working all together to make sure that we're ready for it. I think we at CDC are really optimistic around the early data around these vaccines. And we want to make sure that the delivery systems are equally ready when the vaccines become available. We don't want there to be any gaps from the time that the vaccines are recommended by ACIP. We want to be able the next day, frankly, to start these programs. So that's why we're talking about scaling up now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Massinier. Are there any questions from the voting members? Dr. Hunter.
Thanks. I apologize in advance if there's background noise. I just had some comments. Can you hear me first of all?
We can.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at flu vaccine events this fall as practice for COVID vaccine events later. I agree with Dr. Massinier that traditional mass clinics by local health departments that take place indoors and without social distancing are not necessarily the best model for what we're going to be looking at with COVID. During the COVID pandemic, for any mass clinic, any mass vaccination for flu or for COVID. And traditionally, these kind of mass clinics take place at places away from facilities that have established vaccines or refrigerators, such as like in schools, rather than at or next door to pharmacies or clinics. Finally, I was going to mention that I'm part of a community-wide effort in Milwaukee in my role as a medical consultant to the City of Milwaukee Health Department. And as part of that, I'm encouraging folks who are starting on pilots already to expand that idea. And what their pilots include that I think are good are walk-through or drive-through events that occur outside and adjacent to pharmacies and clinics. So that's my personal way I'm looking at what's going to work in the world I work in. And I just thought I'd mention that. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate those thoughts, Dr. Hunter. One of the concepts that we've been talking about is something that actually we don't talk about in the US, but globally, those of you who have worked on vaccines should be familiar with the concept of microplanning, which is what happens when a country is planning, for example, for a polio campaign or a measles campaign. It's much more detailed planning than we have traditionally done, even in flu vaccines. And that's what we think we need to be doing in this situation. We need to be doing much more concrete microplanning with each state and local health department so that they can take into account their local factors and come up with creative solutions. From our part, we're also trying to work on some IT solutions that would help, for example, in terms of scheduling clinics. And we're working with a variety of our partners across Operation Warp Speed in terms of creative solutions to how you might basically do mobile or mass clinics, pop-up clinics. And there are a variety of private partners who actually have some pretty innovative approaches to this. Again, appreciate all the complexity, and I can talk in generalities, but in the end, it's where the rubber hits the road. It's out to you all in the field who are going to have to operationalize this, and that's why we want to get past where we are now quickly so that we can start that level of planning with, again, every locale, because that's what we think it's going to take. This is a huge challenge, and it's going to require a lot of advanced planning, but also a lot of boots on the ground. Over.
Thank you. Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Massinier. I wanted to ask, regarding your slide that shows the ramp up versus the peak, I actually, that graphic was actually extremely helpful, and although intuitive, I find it useful for us to think about, in part because although we understand recommendations will drive implementation, we're also cognizant of the fact that implementation is in our evidence to recommendation framework, and some of those implementation considerations might impact recommendations in different phases. So with that in mind, my question to you is really around during the ramp-up phase versus the peak phase. You had talked about traditional versus innovative delivery systems. Could you give us a sense of existing sort of what is the feasibility around implementation during the ramp-up phase of traditional versus innovative? And then obviously at a peak time, our hope is that we'll be able to do all of it. But just again, thinking about the efforts it will require to be able to, efficiently distribute vaccines to as many people as possible. Your input.
Yeah, this slide makes it look like it's simple and it's either one side or the other, and we all know it's not going to be like this. There are any number of iterations that one could imagine and plan for. It reminds me a little of the language we talk about all models are wrong and some models are useful. And I think that you're right. We're trying to sort of show just a paradigm to start thinking about it, since we can't know all the possibilities. What I'm talking about in terms of traditional versus innovative, in some ways traditional vaccination in my mind is people going to the doctor's office to get vaccinated. Some innovative approaches would be, for example, if ACIP recommends a focus on essential workers, partnering with pharmacies to be able to deliver vaccine to essential workers in a way that decreases barriers to access. Many hospitals already do vaccination, but frankly, back to what Paul said, a lot of them probably do vaccination in mass vaccination availabilities. We're working on some IT solutions that would allow folks to sign up in advance, to identify their eligibility, and then to basically schedule a time to get vaccinated. So I think some of that is perhaps what I was thinking of in terms of innovation. And I expect that this won't be a black-white either-or approach, but for example, for long-term care facilities, I think there are many complexities with vaccinating people in long-term care facilities, one of which is the vaccine likely will have to go to them. There will be issues about informed consent or assent to vaccination, and complexities in terms of underlying medical conditions that frankly will complicate things. There are some private groups that actually already have abilities to vaccinate in long-term care facilities. And so we're looking at those groups to see if there's, and again, many of these private groups are very willing and interested to do their part. So trying to figure out how we can activate all the private providers and who are perhaps a little less traditional, but could be part of the solution in these groups. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Dr. Finley, please. Dr. Finley?
Hi, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Dr. Mesnier. As a state program manager, I want to acknowledge that many states are actively planning and coordinating with preparedness and our state emergency operation committees. And we're building on the active structure in place. We're making use of what's available because we're already in an emergency action to develop IT, communication, and other pieces. So this isn't something that we're thinking needs to happen. Many of us are actively working on multiple subgroups and moving forward with it.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that. And I think some states and locales are farther ahead. And, I've had a couple conversations with state health officers who, frankly, like sometimes at CDC, it's there's always the crisis of the day, and frankly, those crises are huge, and it's hard, I think, sometimes for folks to wall off a team to think about something that, in some ways, folks feel like is 6 months away. And I think part of our messaging to state and local health departments is going to be the importance of starting this planning now. I think some states have already embraced that and are doing in that, and that's great. We're going to learn from your examples, but we need plans in every state and locale. And you know, our goal should always be to be prepared before the vaccine becomes available. So appreciate that you guys are ahead. Not surprised about that. We just want everyone to get to the same place where the plans are in place and ready to go, shovel ready, when the vaccine gets here.
Thank you, Dr. Maldonado.
Yes, thank you, Nancy. That was a really nice presentation. Thank you for talking about the racial and ethnic disparities. And in particular, I wanted to ask you a little more, speaking to what you just mentioned about being prepared before the vaccine is available. Can you tell me a little bit more, tell us a little bit more about who you're engaging with now? Are there focus groups? Who are your key stakeholders in communities of color, particularly societies, other partners? I know we talk about local partners, but national leadership and partners. I know the NAM has a committee now to look at prioritization, but I think we need to think about other partner organizations and thinking about how to engage with them and their constituents, and looking at focus groups and how to build out that trust that you mentioned early on. So can you talk a little bit about what and how?
Yeah, I mean, mostly what I would say is to agree with you. You know, we have our traditional immunization partners, and I mean we, the royal we, many of whom are around the virtual ACIP table, but especially around communities of color, we need to think way outside the box in terms of who are trusted stakeholders. And I think for me, one of the lessons from some of the work that we've been doing recently is, and frankly, even going back to think about the measles outbreaks in, was that a year ago, is how much of this is local. And so I think we really need to get past the national traditional organizations and much more cognizant of who folks, of who we need to engage. We need a much broader, deeper stakeholder engagement than we already have. And, you know, again, I feel already behind, but frankly, this is where we are today. And, you know, this is our call to action for all of you. We need to get moving on stakeholder engagement. And so many of you will be hearing from us very soon as we start to figure this out. I think organizing across such broad and deep set of stakeholders and partners is going to be complicated. And, you know, we will definitely be looking in for advice, input, and help from the traditional partners in immunization.
Dr. Freihoffer.
Thank you. Sandra Freihoffer, American Medical Association. Speaking as a practicing general internist, a primary care physician, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I appreciate you thinking out of the box about non-traditional ways to distribute and administer vaccination. But please don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't leave off the traditional methods of delivery. Remember that physician recommendation is a major motivator of vaccination, especially with this one. The warp speed in which these vaccines are being developed raise concerns, as you mentioned, of possible cost cutting. And right now, especially with this vaccine, physician recommendation is so important in getting patients vaccinated. So please make sure that primary care physicians have access to vaccine. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Freihoffer, thank you for articulating that. I wholeheartedly agree with you. Private physicians are key parts of our routine immunization infrastructure and key partners in talking to their patients about immunization. So you will get no arguments from me about the importance of engaging those groups. And frankly, when I'm talking about some of these non-traditional methods, I shouldn't have implied that I meant separated from private providers. Optimally, private providers will be part of of some of those innovations. You know, as Dr. Hunter said, in some cases vaccinating within their own healthcare sector, you know, there may be innovative approaches to delivery, but we would certainly hope that local health engages those private providers in thinking through what those options are, and those private providers become major stakeholders, visible stakeholders in implementing some of those non-traditional approaches. So, you know, you have my complete agreement.
Thank you. A quick word, we're running a little bit behind. So there are two more questions in the queue. That's Ms. McNally and Dr. Dushin. And then we're going to cut it at that point and move on to the next topic. And I'll check with Dr. Cohn to see if we're going to have a small break here. But please, Ms. McNally, please go forward.
Thank you. Dr. Messing, this information has been very helpful. I'm specifically interested in understanding whether a vaccine becomes available through traditional FDA approval or an emergency use authorization. Do you anticipate any changes to the current mechanisms that are in place for safety monitoring?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Absolutely. I wouldn't say changes as much as I would say enhancements. And so, you know, we're certainly going to rely on some of the tried and true systems that we use for monitoring adverse events, but we need to enhance them in terms of, for example, speed and robustness, and we need to make sure that they're penetrating all of the populations that may be getting access to vaccine. Part of the planning for us is imagining what groups might get vaccinated first and making sure, especially in those populations, that we really have built out adverse events monitoring. Certainly, adverse events in those populations could derail the whole effort. And also, we certainly have seen incorrect adverse events derail immunization efforts. And so it's really important that we have our normal systems building on them to be more robust, and especially in the groups that might be vaccinated first. I think we'll have more presentations to ACIP about this, but you know, it's essential that, and you know, we rely on ACIP to look at our safety monitoring plans and point out any holes that they see, because we want to make sure that ACIP and our partners and in general the American public are confident in our plans. And so we'll be, I think, talking more about this. Yes, Amanda says yes, we'll be talking more about this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dushin.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for your presentation and for what you're doing to support our vaccination program. I was a little surprised to hear the discussion about detailed implementation planning, given all the unknowns. Is there guidance that has been issued to states and locals to guide us on what's appropriate to do at this stage, given the unknowns and the limited resources? And do you expect additional funding to come to support local immunization program implementation?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dushin, for asking that question. Even in the setting of so many unknowns, we have to start planning. And so we believe that the moment is now to plan, and planning needs to be flexible to accommodate the range of what we think the possibilities are in a parsimonious way in terms of which vaccines with which characteristics and how many doses are available. So I wish I could say that if we waited another month, you would have absolute clarity about those things, but knowing that we won't, we believe we need to get started in planning. CDC has not yet put out detailed guidance. This is for us really the launch of that next phase. We will be putting together more detailed guidance, but frankly, equally importantly, we will be providing technical assistance to state and local health departments as they develop their plans, and are working very closely with the variety of partners, including our colleagues in the Department of Defense, who have tremendous expertise in logistics and planning. and ask us lots of hard, great questions that make us turn over more rocks and look underneath and make sure that there's nothing that we're missing. And so we'll be moving into the next phase of more detailed planning, working with state and local health departments, providing technical expertise, but frankly also engendering more of a community of practice where states that have already started their planning, we want to learn from them, and we want to take those lessons and help states that are a little farther behind. You know, this planning is not going to be easy, and we need to rely on the things that we've planned for already, but the context of COVID is very different, and therefore we're going to need to be more flexible, and we're going to need to be flexible up until the moment when those vaccines become available, because frankly, there are still many things that may look different on that day. So it's not going to be easy, but you know, we're going to count on all of you as partners there with us.
Thank you very much. So we're running about 10, 12 minutes late overtime. So let's take a 2 to 3 minute break for you all to stretch your legs, walk around a little bit, and then we'll restart. Expect me to call to order again in about 2 to 3 minutes. We'll go on break.